Oh, we're live. Hi, Eric. Welcome to Venture with Grace.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on, and it was so great meeting you last week.
Yeah, yeah, likewise.
Maybe I want to start out the show with like a little bit of your background. So now you're the founder of Modal, and like before that, you have worked on at iconic companies like Google, DHL, Spotify, where you built your career. Basically, I feel like maybe we could talk about like what were some core lessons that you've learned early on in your career that kind of shape you into who you are today. Oh, also like you were the CTO of Better.com and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I think in particular, I learned most of it through Spotify. That was my sort of formative experience. I was there for 7 years, and I started straight out of school, and sort of spent, I was number 40 when we joined, and I think
Mhm,
we're 2000 when we left. So
mhm,
that was really kind of where I cut my teeth, like building systems, like hiring people, building teams, like learning how to work with other people.
mhm.
And it was a crazy startup growing very fast. And so now I consider myself this like startup degenerate. I don't think I could ever work at a big company. I wouldn't even know how to do it.
I feel you. Maybe we could talk about like what were the things that you were doing at Spotify? You were doing the music recommendation system. Like, how is my music recommended to me? Tell me, please.
Yeah, so I joined Spotify to build a music recommendation system, and eventually, like, basically, like what we realized, like after I joined, was like we needed more help with like
Mhm,
business intelligence,
mhm,
and then, but eventually, I came back to music recommendations and built it. The way it works is basically like the idea is like called collaborative filtering, and the idea is like build a bunch of algorithms that have no idea what music is about. Like we're just looking at trying to find pattern in what people consume.
mhm,
So we look at consumption patterns, and there's a few different ways you can do it. Like one way you can do it is like you can look at playlist, and you can look at like what are tracks in those playlists,
mhm,
and you can almost like think about it as like a LLM or like a language model task, like NLP task, like natural language processing, where like you have a playlist, and then every track in that playlist is like a word, and you're basically trying to predict like what's the next track in that playlist and learn a statistical model based on that.
mhm,
Although you don't care about the words really, like there's no correspondence. Like every track is just its own like unique token.
mhm,
uh and by doing that, you end up like basically like learning a bunch of vector representations for every
mhm,
track and every playlist and every user and every artist.
mhm,
And then you can and it's like a high dimensional vector, not as high dimensional as many LLMs. Like we use 40 dimensions at Spotify. It's like kind of enough. And then you can look in this space, this 40 dimensional space, and you can look for like nearest neighbors basically. And
mhm.
so you can search the space. So like, so basically like the idea is like if 2 points are close in the space, they're probably very similar.
For sure. Okay, so that's really interesting. And I wonder how does that like kind of translate into your next job as a CTO of Better.com? And then maybe obviously we'll dive into how you built Modal.
Not at all. I mean, I learned a lot about Spotify, more about like building consumer products,
Hmm.
and I think that was very helpful in building teams and all kinds of stuff. And I don't know, better was like kind of I wanted to try something new, and it was very different. And I ended up staying there at 6 years because the company was growing like crazy. Then I left, and like right after I left, it sort of collapsed a little bit, but now it kind of came back more recently. So it's a very different experience. In hindsight, I don't know if like it was like the perfect place for me, but I learned an enormous amount of stuff, and was very useful in terms of building culture and like building teams and growing very fast and
Hmm.
raising money and board meetings and all kinds of other stuff.
For sure. What would you say are like I guess like maybe tell us more about like when you started like building Modal, like how did it started happening, and then like what were the things that you were like seeing that's like in the space that's missing? Um, yeah.
Yeah, I started building Modal because a lot of what I realized about Spotify, about infrastructure, was that like as I was trying to build all these complex applications, I ended
Hmm.
up spending way more time on just like building the underlying infrastructure. In particular, actually at Spotify, I built this open source framework called Luigi for like workflow scheduling, but I also built a lot of other stuff. And it felt like kind of weird. I was like spending way more time on like the underlying infrastructure than the actual like building the applications on top.
Hmm.
So at some point I realized, and this is like, when I started Modal like many years later,
Hmm.
that someone should just build that infrastructure, right? Like all these companies, Spotify is like, there's nothing unique to Spotify about this infrastructure. They just want to run like big machine learning or AI or data jobs. And it's just kind of annoying to do that. So someone should just build this like infrastructure layer that lets people run stuff in the cloud and not have to think about provisioning and load balancing and scaling and containerization, all that stuff. So we built that.
I wonder, maybe we could talk about like serverless platform for AI ML, like because like I think you were chatting with like I mean I was listening to other podcasts, like I think you were chatting with Eli Geld about like in the past like you never thought like people want to run their own like data on top of like other people's like computer, and but like kind of like it kind of shifted after a while. Like maybe we could talk about like how do you find the solution for the current, AI ecosystem, basically.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of what I realized is like a lot of the traditional infrastructure that existed at that time, Kubernetes, or going back even further, is like things like Hadoop or whatever. A lot of that infrastructure wasn't just, it really wasn't well suited for these new types of AI workloads. When you start to have to deal with large models and GPUs and, more like fast feedback loops for developers. And so what we realized is like, you kind of need to build something new, right? And that's when we ended up spending 2 years almost in a cave, like just building all this like foundational technology, our own file system and our own container runtime and a scheduler and all these things. And it was really to serve, what we felt like was like a big gap in the market.
Can you share a little bit more about like how was the past, like you mentioned like Hadoop or like Kubernetes, like everything else was run, and then versus like Model today. 1 second, let me just turn off my window because I feel like there's a mega construction. I don't know if you can hear. Okay, yeah, I'm back. Sorry.
No, it's all good. Yeah, so I mean, if you look at like Kubernetes, for instance, like a lot of it is built for backend applications. So it's more like kind of CRUD apps, apps mostly waiting for databases or coordinating with other systems, and it works pretty well for that kind of stuff. Like developers can like test those locally pretty well, and then when they're done, then they deploy it on Kubernetes, and it runs in the cloud and stuff like that. When you're developing AI apps, like first of all, you need GPUs, and so most developers don't have GPUs locally, so they need to run that in the cloud somehow. And like using Kubernetes for that is just kind of annoying. You have to build a Docker container, push it to the cloud, run it in the cloud, get results. Like it's just very slow feedback loops. So that was like the biggest thing we like the big problem that we started focus on was just like, how do we take code on a developer's laptop and like run it in the cloud, and do that in a way where it feels like you're running things locally. Because if you get the cloud experience to feel like you're developing locally, then you solve a big part of the problem with building software and running it in the cloud. Later, we realized that this is also extremely valuable if you're doing things like inference, because if you can figure out a way to start containers very fast, and it's kind of the same problem, then you can scale up and down very fast too. And so you build this serverless system that can that I think has a lot of benefits, especially when you're dealing with these like very expensive GPUs. Those are some of the inspirations for why we decided you kind of need to start over. You can't take the existing stuff and build some stuff on top of it. You kind of need to start over and build a whole new infra stack.
For sure. I feel like in the similar-ish space, there's like a few companies like, Together AI and some other companies. Like maybe we could start with like, what is the key differentiation like when you are building Model? Like, what are something that you kind of like have in mind that's like will differentiate you guys with other players in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that are different from us. I mean, first of all, we're different than the cloud vendors, right? Like we're kind of one layer up. Like we use a lot of different cloud vendors. We use AWS and GCP and Azure and Oracle and many other ones. And they're great at like physical infrastructure, but they're not really developer experience. I think if there's like there's a gap higher up in the stack, and I think they recognize there's a lot of opportunity to innovate on that. And so we consider a lot of them partners, and we might use other cloud providers in the future. I think in the higher level stack, like I think there's like a couple of things that differentiate us from other vendors. So I mean, first of all, one thing is like we're very multi-purpose. Like we're very we don't just power LM inference, or not just inference. We also power training, fine tuning, batch processing, code execution, and many more things to come. Like we have storage primitives and networking primitives and all these other stuff. So we aim to be way more of a general purpose system that you can compose a lot of different building blocks to build something very general. The other thing is developer experience. I should have started with that because that's actually the biggest thing. Is we have way better developer experience. Like we really spend our an enormous amount of time like obsessing over Python SDK and making it easy for developers to iterate fast and write natural code. And then the third thing is like we spend so much time innovating in the core infrastructure layer, like building all these like low level primitives. And I frankly, when I look at like anyone else in the landscape today, there's no one else that like goes as deep as we do and kind of rethink container infrastructure and file systems and all kind of stuff like that.
I wonder, so I guess like when it comes to like the business side, like how do you think about the market? So like since you mentioned like these like GPU providers, they are kind of like you guys are like a layer above them basically, and like how do you think about like since you just raised like, by the way, congratulations on the raise.
Thank you.
Yeah. So since like you just raised like 87 million, like why don't we talk about like how are you spending the money into like building the next generation of model? And then like when you are thinking about like how does like money flow in the entire industry? Because like obviously from as a vibe coder, I feel like I always heard about like people spend out like a lot of money on GPUs. But like how much money, and like what is that, like a 70%, 80%, or like what is it meant to kind of like, I guess, how does the money flow in the entire stack?
I mean, there's no doubt that a lot of it ends up in Jensen Huang's pockets eventually. If you think about like where we are in the stack, I mean, we're not a software margin business, but we have like relatively okay margins. I mean, we buy GPUs, right? Or like we rent GPUs. We don't actually buy them; we just rent them. And then in a way, like we add a lot of software on top of it, and that enables us to charge more for the customers. So our customers are application developers, right? And so our margins aren't software margins, but they're like quite okay, right? And then and so when you think about the money we raised, it certainly doesn't go towards GPUs because that's what we use our revenue for. So the revenue is what we use to pay the cloud. That's the COGS, right? And I think that's quite important. You can't fudge. I think there's maybe companies out there like using the raising money and then buying GPUs, and that's okay if you're maybe trading a model because that's a capital expenditure then. But for us, like running GPUs, that's the cost of goods, and so it goes into our margins. So and since we have positive margins, it's our customer revenue that funds the GPUs. What do we use the money for? It's primarily labor. I mean, that's the thing that costs a lot of money, like hiring engineers, building out a world-class go-to-market team. Then, of course, a little bit of other stuff like office space and whatever. But the big thing is really humans and building an engineering team, and that's, we think that's the right thing to do. Like we think it's fine to burn money in the interest of investing in R&D. We think those will pay amazing dividends over the next 20 years, and so that's fundamentally, I mean, I think not different than any other VC funded startup is we have positive gross margins, but we're burning money overall, but we're also investing a lot in R&D and hiring a lot of engineers, and we're building some amazing features that we think will help us get the next few customers.
For sure. How do you think about hiring engineers? Like what type of engineer do you feel like it's like useful profile for you?
Yeah, I think maybe dichotomizing a little bit, but like we found it like kind of useful to think in terms of like two different profiles. Like one is sometimes we just go and hire like super cracked people like straight out of school, like super smart people that are like quite junior in their career. Like we don't really care. Like they're just like smart and like able to write a lot of code. And then on the other side of the spectrum, sometimes we need like people who are like really understand something very specific, right, around like distributed systems or Linux kernels or GPU performance. And in that case, we hire a little bit more like senior. We're talking like 5, 10, 15 years experience. In practice, it's a little bit more complex. There's other roles too, but I think those are like the two main buckets of labor that we hire.
How, I guess like as a CEO, how do you spend your own time on like building the product itself versus like selling it? And then like, since you're selling to like application developers, like, what is the go-to-market strategy right now for you guys?
A lot of it so far in the last couple of years has really been inbound, and I think of it as like founder-led marketing. I spent a lot of time in my early days at Modal, like just tweeting and talking about the product with people, and that was enough to like drive a lot of inbound. And I think we've gotten to a really good point. I mean, we're doing $60 million in annualized revenue,
Mhm,
and that's like without almost doing any sort of sales and marketing. We started building out a marketing team over the last year or so, and we're still like relatively small.
mhm,
Now we're starting to see a lot of success also with like more like traditional enterprise marketing. So we're building that up very quickly. We're also building up a marketing team. But I think it's sort of coming from it from a little bit of a different angle. We have like a very solid foundation of product-led growth, and I think it
mhm,
really reflects the product being just like having amazing developer experience and being very good at like self-service. And we have many examples of customers signing up themselves, putting in a credit card, starting
mhm,
to write code, and like over time spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a month on Modal or even more, uh, barely without talking. I mean, at some point we reach out to people, spend a
mhm,
lot of money, but fundamentally we're talking about people who they didn't need selling in order to use Modal. The selling was like they tried out the product and they liked it, and
mhm,
having that like really strong
mhm,
product like foundation, I think has led us to have like very capital efficient growth, and I
mhm.
think fundamentally just reflects that the product is good.
I guess like what's a target user profile? Like is that like a other seed stage or Series A stage startups, or were they more towards like, Shopify, Spotify, or like any other kind of like enterprise-ish company?
Well, I think in terms of personas, it tends to be machine learning engineers, like people building machine learning applications who need to run models or train models or run big data processing jobs. In
Mhm,
terms of companies, I think it kind of reflects a little bit of like the adoption pattern of Gen AI. Like initially,
mhm,
when we started a couple of years ago, started seeing traction, it was mostly coming from like Gen AI native companies. So these are companies like, I don't know, Suno does like AI generative music, and
mhm,
similar companies like doing generative media or like things that are like kind of new.
mhm,
Over time, we've seen way more traction also coming from like established companies. Like, you're talking about, public companies or digital natives or enterprise companies. And then I think it reflects the fact that they are now starting to put a lot of this stuff into production.
mhm,
And that's often when they come to us for help because running this stuff in production is hard. A couple of other verticals we've done really well is like vibe coding platforms more recently. It's
mhm,
like seen a huge surge, and we power code execution. We have like a primitive sandboxes for running untrusted third-party code. So it
mhm,
works really well for that. And then another vertical is actually computational biotech, where we see a lot of traction right now. We have a lot of customers
mhm,
using us for protein folding or modeling binding affinities or some really cool stuff. I mean, like we're talking about like developing drugs that will save people's lives and cure
mhm,
cancer or whatever. It's like kind of a fun, not just fun. It's awesome to see that as opposed to like a lot of our other customers. Not
mhm.
to trivialize it, but there's a lot of sort of face swapping and like fun kind of stuff. But like there's also this sort of serious stuff. So we power a very broad swath of very different types of users.
For sure. So like, I mean, for the biotech people, like what would be their like typical spending on something like this? It's like hundreds of millions. I mean,
I mean, some of them, yeah. Like, and not to say I don't. I mean, we obviously don't have customers spending that much. Like our total revenue right now, as mentioned,
yeah.
is like $60 million. But like but it's growing extremely fast, and like I think over time, like we should be able to capture a lot of those customers. There's enormous willingness to spend.
Mhm,
If you're developing new drugs and you can use computers for something maybe traditional you'd have to use clinical trials for or
mhm.
physical running stuff in a lab. Now you can simulate using computers, and so there's a lot of willingness to spend money on this. There's a lot of money in drugs.
How I guess like how much money are people spending on like training the model? And then like I guess that the other questions I had was like, obviously you guys have landed some like really big names like Scale AI, Ram, Cora, Lovable, like those are all like your clients, right? So how I guess like how do you think about like the go to market for these like kind of like superstar companies?
It's a mix. I mean, some of them have come inbound, some of them have been outbound. um, I mean, I think that's like something where we're starting to see a lot of traction in that space now,
Mhm,
and it sort of reflects that these companies are now putting a lot of stuff in production and wanting to scale up. And so yeah, that's why we're investing very hard right now in an enterprise go-to-market team, and that wasn't necessarily the case 2 years ago, but now we feel like, it's time to, and that's part of why we're raising money too. Is these deals, they take a lot more handholding. Like you need to deal with infosec questionnaires and understanding org structures and spending time so doing solutions engineering or other things. But on the other hand, there's way more upside also in those deals, we think.
I wonder, so like you mentioned, like you were selling to like the ML engineers, but I feel like everybody at some of these company like Lovable or something. So I feel like everybody's kind of like ML engineers. So like, do you sell to the CEO first, or like how does the kind of like approach has been if you are outbounding? I mean, obviously, if it's like inbound, like I guess like what type of profile of people would just like inbound? So it's just like the engineer who are like, hey, we need to use this product immediately, and
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has been bottoms up at the smaller companies, of course. And I mean, or like, honestly, I think the bottoms up and top down is kind of the same thing. Because like typically what you have with these companies is like you have a CTO who's still writing code, also has a credit card. So the buyer and the decision maker and the end user is the same person. At a later stage company, those are maybe three different people. So it's a little bit of a different thing. In that case, often the machine learning engineers, they might be the champion, but separately you have a platform team who's maybe more of the like end user, like in the sense that like they will like bring the maintain the system, and then you have of course a CTO who's maybe overseeing everything, and then there's like separate like a security team that has to approve everything, and so you need to spend time with all of those personas and make sure they feel good about Modal.
how do you kind of like budget your own time? So like would it be like, let's say 80% of your time on like selling the product, or like would it be like 80% of the time that's just building the product?
I wish it was that much time on building and selling. I feel like as a CTO I end up spending also a lot of other time. I mean, like something like recruiting, right? Like I spend a lot of time recruiting people. Like I think it's so important to spend time. Like it's like humans are the root of everything. Like
Mm-hmm.
so recruiting is a big one. Spend
Mm-hmm.
how much of time like generally involved in like the system. I almost think of it as like, I mean, this is a very technical product, so it's basically a product. Like
Mm-hmm.
looking at the behavior of the system, looking at the SDK, like trying to understand from a user behavior point of view, like how to work. I do spend a lot of time selling.
Mm-hmm.
Spend a lot of time like talking to customers. Spend a fair amount of time also in like investor relationships, and like there's always like the existing round, but then there's the next round, and building up like proactively like relationships with investors and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And of course there's always like random like legal stuff, like I spend too much time like optimizing like option stuff and taxes for the employees. It's
Mm-hmm.
like something I spent way too much time on. We really need to hire a general counsel, I think, over time. What else do I spend time on? I spend a little bit of time on like cost structure, like understanding our cost and how we can optimize that cost. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, I don't know. Unloading the dishwasher. Like, I don't know. There's just so much stuff at a startup. Like, someone has to do, and like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I feel like if you're not willing to jump in and do almost anything at a startup, like you probably shouldn't be the CEO. I think that's the beauty of the startup. Also, is like, like you everyone kind of jumps in and is ready to do almost anything, whatever it takes to make the company successful.
When I guess like one of the things I find really interesting is like the pricing model. So like obviously it's online. It's like some of them, for example, the GPU task is like some of them is like $6.25 per hour. There's like a per second rate, and I wonder how does, or like for example, you also have like the team or enterprise, like different like kind of like pricing model. I feel like nowadays like a popular pricing model is like um result outcome based pricing. So like instead of like per seat pricing. Like, so how do you think about pricing for your product? And since you mentioned earlier that like all the GPU cost is like coming from the revenue, so like you get the revenue first, I guess, like, and then you pay the GPU, or like what's your relationship like with all these GPU provider? Like, do you kind of front load the usage, or like front load money, or like how do you kind of like think about that?
Yeah. So first of all, on pricing, I think it's actually relatively straightforward. I mean, our underlying cost is like per GPU hour or like per GPU second, and so So I think it makes sense just from like a cost alignment perspective to manifest that to customers. I think the other thing is like that's just what customers are used to because that's what everyone else uses.
Mhm.
So the fact that we're like usage based, I think it's just kind of natural function of just being in the same space. We are a little bit different. We're serverless, and so I think like one thing we kind of struggle with is just like maybe explaining to people like, well, these are like you only pay for the time the GPU is actually running as we scale up and down. You never pay for idle capacity. You don't have to make reservations, right? Like, and most people understand that there's a lot of differentiation and it's worth paying extra. We often talk about like our, effective cost is often much lower, even though our list price might be a little bit higher.
Mhm.
And then so all the other stuff I think is the pricing structure. We do have team plans and we have the other stuff. I think that's going to evolve over time. I think we probably going to figure out like other ways to charge people, but like when you're talking about things like RBAC or audit trails or logging and stuff like that, a lot of that is harder to charge
Mhm.
on a usage based, in a usage based way. So my feeling is always like you kind of have to just bundle all of that and sell it as like an enterprise tier, and then you have to charge it in some other way, and that's usually like a team cost or per seat basing or something like that. What was the other question you were asking? You were asking about
Yeah, like why not like outcome based pricing? There's like, yeah, I feel like
I
that's
think
maybe
that's
more,
hard.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's hard. I think that's hard. I feel like you asked something else too, but I lost my chain of thought.
I think, yeah, that's primarily it about like the pricing. Also, like, what is a kind of like profit margin look like for something like this?
I think like the end state profit margins, if you look at state of the art cloud vendors, like you can get it to like 50%, and that's where like EC2 is, for instance, in AWS. And so we see a lot of ways we can optimize our margins, like fundamentally we're not going to have software margins on this business, like that's just not who we are. But we think we can get the steady state margins to 40, 50, maybe 60% just on the compute itself. And then, much like AWS has EC2 and many other services, we also think there's going to be many opportunities to build a lot of stuff on top of it. We already have things like notebooks and other things. And so
Mhm.
we think sort of the compound margins, like the blended average of all of that, we think we can get it to, I don't know, 60%, is maybe even higher if, in the very long run. Oh,
Uh,
you're asking something about the terms of the revenue. Basically, we have very low working capital needs because almost all of our costs are like on a net 30 basis, and we also our customers pay on a net 30 basis. So there's very little working capital requirement in this business.
I wonder, so like when you are thinking about, I guess like the entire landscape of like infrastructure, I obviously prepare this graph for you. Sorry, where I'm just looking at the graph. So basically it is a yeah, I'll just go on the original website instead of like sharing this graph. So I mean, I was like looking at like just right before our chat, I found a different graph, but I was gonna pull out the Bessemer infra graph like for the infrastructure space. Um, so there's like a lot of different subsegment. Let me just quickly grab this one. Um, so for example, something like this.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Wait, how do you think about like where would the most amount of like innovation coming from slash like money is gonna flow into and why basically? Or like what do you think is like missing in this graph?
I mean, there's so many things here that I don't know if anything is missing. So I don't know, man. I think there's just so many. I'm trying to pull up like a similar one. If you ever see am I able to share?
Yeah, you're able to share too. It's present or invite.
Okay, I have to go to system setting. No, never mind. I was going to share the Matt Turk publishes every
Oh,
year.
yeah. Someone said this earlier too. So
It's insane. It's insane. Like it started out being like 20 boxes, and now it's like
yeah, like
2,000 boxes.
it's like 20 pages basically.
I mean, like I feel like if anything, there's like too much stuff here. Like everyone's like trying to solve like point solutions, and that's like sort of my like my gripe with. Oh yeah, there you go. like that's my challenge with with the whole thing is like everyone's just like solving like a thing, but like they're not going after the bigger issues. Like they're trying to replace like a point, solution with another point solution. I kind of feel like maybe we're like crazy, but like we're trying to rip out the entire infra stack and replace,
AWS.
yeah, no, I'm not AWS, but like we're trying to replace like, you know, 50 of these logos with Modal. Like I don't know, or I mean not replace because they're probably going to be around, but like we're trying to do 100 of these things, right? Like we're not trying to do like one of these things.
Yeah, for sure. I was trying to ask you that, like, what are something that you feel like um you are on, like, I guess, like, the function and solution that you are trying to target, and then, like, why?
Sorry, what do you mean? Like in terms of like what
So
you
for
mean, right?
example, you mentioned like some of the current solution that will be like replaced, and then, like, obviously, basically, I think your point was like for each different subsegment for like a specific domain that you like there is like an existing solution for it. So for example, like data quality, observability, or something like that. Like there is like a solution for that. But on the other hand, like how do you think about like which area to go after to like make the most amount of impact?
I think that's almost like that's incredibly hard because we can only do that much right now, right? Like we're not AWS. We don't have like 50,000 engineers. We have 50 engineers. So the sequence here is very hard, right? But like we started out building like an underlying, compute layer, and I think that's increasingly more and more mature. There's a lot of stuff still to be done. We're working a lot on lowering latency, for instance.
Mhm,
Um, but like having kind of put that in place, I think there's a lot of opportunity now to kind of do a lot of high stuff up in the stack.
mhm,
So I think, yeah, I mean, like in the long run, like we always wanted to cover the entire AI
mhm,
life cycle, right? Like all the way from like, okay, you want to train a model, then you have to like first get the data, then you have to run a bunch of data prep on that data, then you have to train the model, then you have to deploy that model, and then you have to deal with the model in production. So you want like observability, you need feature stores, you need so that's just like one thing, right? Like that's sort of end-to-end like AI stuff, and then there's a bunch of stuff around it like experiment tracking,
mhm,
notebooks, like data munging, like analyzing large data sets, like querying stuff, real-time streaming. Like I think, and the benefit of like the approach we're taking is like I think there's very strong integration advantages of like I hate the word synergies, but like that's basically what it is, right? Like building A and B, you actually get like way more value than like A and B in isolation because you
mhm,
have like very strong integration points, especially if you own the compute layer. And that's I think something a lot of startups don't, is like because they don't have the compute layer to monetize. So we can build all these other all these products, and maybe some of them you know doesn't actually drive revenue, but it drives revenue indirectly through the compute layer. So like I think that's the benefit of having this like kind of platform approach where you make money through the compute, but then you build all these other stuff, and it all sort of becomes this like multi-product platform that
mhm,
like really solves all your AI application
mhm.
concerns.
I wonder, so like in terms of like um the I don't know if you see the only like I mean, what is your take on like the OpenAI's like new launch for their like dev day? So like I just saw a bunch of like applications that are there's like I guess like three trends I'm seeing. One is like you are able to connect like a lot of different apps on top of the platform. There's like an agent kit that's like, kind of like help you build agents. And then, you can connect to Canva or like Zillow or some other like platforms on top of OpenAI. But I think like I see just like so much like no code tools. So like just like tools out for like non-technical people. Are you building something in the non-technical end
No,
too? Or like you hate
no.
us?
I think in order to be successful, you have to decide pretty early on like a persona and like focus on
Mhm,
that. And our persona is very much developers, so we're proudly high code. And I think it's I think a lot of people get pulled in sort of a no code, low code direction. But if you look at actual AI spend, it's like mostly controlled by engineers in the end. That's not entirely true. I mean, there are like very successful consumer products. I mean, ChatGPT being an obvious example,
mhm,
right? But and we're probably not going to power ChatGPT, but like we might power like a lot of the chat applications in the future. So we're going to be that. My view is like we're going to be there somewhere in the stack, and there's going to be developers deploying stuff on us, and of course, somewhere else there's going to be consumers using the product because you need an end user. But we want to focus on the developers because at the end of the day, they tend to control most of the spend when it comes to AI or
Mm.
infrastructure as a whole.
I wonder when it comes to like developer spending. So like, or I guess like, um, can you give us like a flow of like, I guess like, what are they spending the most on, and then where is the biggest like entry point for them to start spending?
I mean, it's always been infrastructure, right? Like, if you go to any company and you look at the
Mhm,
distribution of spend by vendor, I mean, now like maybe some companies, OpenAI, right, or Anthropic,
mhm,
but like in the history of the cloud over last 15 years, the number one vendor for almost all tech companies is AWS.
mhm,
And by the way, if you then go and look at like individual teams at that company and you slice it by like AI, machine learning, data, like
mhm,
those are often like disproportionate large spenders
mhm,
on cloud. At
mhm,
Spotify, the data team was, I don't know, maybe 10% of the engineering team, but I think they were like 50% of the like
mhm.
cloud spend or something like that. So targeting those people, like there's a lot of money in that.
Mm. Um, AWS was our amazing conference and previous like podcast sponsor as well. And like I wonder when you're thinking about like disrupting an industry that's like already have an existing player that's like very deep in the space, like AWS, like how do you think about building product and like competing effectively?
Yeah, but we're not really disrupting AWS. Like I think the beautiful thing with AWS is like they make money no matter what, and they're very good at running physical data centers and storage and compute primitives and building kind of broad layers that appeal to a lot of different people. But I've written about this in my blog too. Like you look at something like Redshift versus Snowflake. I think it's kind of a good example because I think it really shows the beauty of AWS's business model.
Mhm,
I think it's fair to say that Snowflake won over Redshift. Redshift and Snowflake are data warehouse products, right? And
mhm,
and, and AWS launched Redshift uh, before Snowflake came. Snowflake is a separate company,
mhm,
and arguably like Snowflake won.
mhm,
But guess what? AWS still makes all the money because like you have to run Snowflake somewhere, and most people run it on AWS, so they still make money. So like maybe they lost a little bit, not having the end user relationship, but I think AWS is actually kind of fine with that because they're always like in the infrastructure layer, and like I don't think they care that much. Um, so that's a cynical view, but the optimistic view is like AWS basically outsourced all their marketing spend to Snowflake, and Snowflake now has to go and win customers, but then AWS makes all the money. I mean, of course, like you can run Snowflake on Azure and Google too, but still like they make a lot of money from Snowflake. So I don't know. Like, no, that's a different one.
that's
Um,
it's a
it's
different blog, but
Storm in the Stratosphere is the blog post. It's a couple years old. So my point is like I think there's a lot of room for us to innovate and on developer experience and building an entirely new infrastructure stack. We're gonna do that on top of the cloud vendors. They're gonna make a lot of money. We're gonna make hopefully a bunch of money too. Um, I consider them way more aligned with us, and I think of them more as partners than competitors.
mm, maybe we could talk about your posts. It's hard to
Yeah,
write for computers, but like I think my biggest takeaway from like the Madrona thing was like, in the past, like people are like thinking about their building for humans, but nowadays like they should be building for agents. I don't know
yeah.
if it's your takeaway, but like obviously, yeah, I don't know.
I mean,
Like,
yeah. We're actually working on a blog post at Modal,
mhm,
and basically like the idea is like uh you know yeah, like turns out like agents also need developer experience. like
mhm,
like I like all the sort of things we've learned about like how to build for humans, it applies to agents too. So like I actually don't know if it's like substantially different. I think a lot of developers are going to leverage, most developers are going to leverage various types of AI products to write code in the future. But like since a lot of coding is built fundamentally for humans, like those AI, it's easier to teach the AI how a human works with code and then like let it do them for them. So I actually don't know if it changes that much.
um, what is your thought concept on like what is your thought concept on like creating these like blocks?
Well, first of all, you make me feel bad because I used to blog a lot, and I kind of
Yeah,
haven't had
just
enough
like the
time.
last
This
one.
is my last blog post, and it's more than a year old, so it's kind of sad.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. I have so many drafts. It's hard. It's hard to write blog posts. Like I actually spend probably 10, 20, sometimes 40 or 100 hours on each blog post in the past, which is like why now I don't really have time to do it.
How do
Yeah,
you write this? Like, what is your new thought? You mentioned about like it's about the agent thing.
yeah, but I'm not writing that one. Someone else doing it. I mean, if you're asking like how I write, like I usually write something and then I kind of just like let it sit for a few days and then I come back to it. And then when coming back to it, like I kind of don't feel as attached to it anymore. So then I like delete like half of it and then I write like some more stuff and then
Mhm,
I let it sit for a few days and then I come back to it. My experience is like writing good blog posts is actually mostly about just like being okay deleting half of the stuff you're writing and you know in order to like because as it turns out like when you're writing a blog post I always have like a million things I want to say, but then I read through it and I realize like half of that stuff is like kind of a sidetrack or kind of besides the point,
mhm.
distracts from the main narrative, or maybe it doesn't really come across as like a particularly the salient point. So
Mhm.
I just delete all of that stuff until like I have like a clear narrative, everything sticks to that main path, you know, everything I write is like reinforces that sort of main narrative, and everything is off that narrative. Just kill it. Just kill it. You save it
What
for another blog post.
I guess like how like what it seems like actually very well researched, like because there's like so many like the plane graph and stuff like that. So like how do you think about like researching that particular um category of things? And I guess like how is this like related to your day-to-day like work? Like how do you kind of like implement some of these thoughts into like the product you're building?
I mean, sometimes I just go to Google Images and I just like grab the first image I see. So sometimes I mean, some another thing I do sometimes is when I have a draft. Again, I don't write much anymore, but when I used to write more, like I would always have like 20 drafts of various blog posts, and for several months, like all I would really do is like when I would find an interesting link, I would just like go and put it in one of the drafts. And then eventually like you know when I look at one of the drafts I would have like 10 different links kind of in the same broad topic, and then you know I would use those as like you know kind of a starting point.
Is the I guess like for the product, I guess like on the product end, like I guess like how much energy do you spend on building the day to day these days? And when you're building for um us like I guess like a AI voice agent startup, that's probably very different than when you're building for serving like bigger clients. And like how do you think about like the kind of like offering that you need to be building to like tailor to particular clients?
I think they mostly need the same stuff. If you look at something like Kubernetes, it kind of serves everyone, and that's the beauty, right? There are obviously things that like bigger companies need sometimes, like they need like RBAC or audit trails or custom stuff around like billing attribution or whatnot, like stuff like that, right? Like, but as it turns out, like they mostly need. I don't know. Maybe that's like a kind of a point that I also like think you know maybe people forget is like I think I feel like a lot of startups like go and talk to big companies, and then big companies like tell them all this stuff they need. But like at the end of the day, like my experience is like they actually don't need all of that.
Mhm,
One particular pet peeve I have is like every big company will tell you they need on prem or some variant thereof. As it
mhm,
turns out, like they actually don't really need it. If they like that's just the way people kind of say no. They're like
mhm.
you know like they actually don't want to have the product. So like if they're truly desperate for something, they're gonna be totally fine with the cloud hosted solution. And
Mm,
you know, so like find that thing that these companies are like truly desperate for, and you're
mhm.
gonna lose like occasionally some people because you don't support on-prem. But in like most cases, you have a much stronger product and it's you know in the cloud and it's awesome. So I don't know. I tend to I mean, there's obviously like I said, there are very like clearly enterprisey type features you should build, but I think there's also a lot of distraction talking to enterprises who often don't know what they want, and you also need to kind of cut through the noise there and ignore a lot of it.
What is your thought on REM pods?
I mean, RunPod is great for like people who want to, hobbyists want to play around and just SSH into a thing and just run some stuff, right? Like, I don't think, they've figured out how to run production workloads to scale up to thousands of GPUs and do that reliably. And, they don't have all these other primitives around code execution and batch processing and the same sort of developer experience that we offer. But, if people just want to SSH into a little box and run some stuff on a GPU, like, might be a good place.
I guess like another question I had was like, since like you mentioned like Amazon is not necessarily the biggest competitor. Obviously, Amazon have like SageMaker and Google Cloud have like
Vertex AI.
Vertex AI. So like I guess like how do you think about why is like the bigger company not going to win in this space, or like what's a
Because those products are not existential to AWS or GCP. I think AWS and GCP, the way they build these types of products is when they see a gap in the market, they'll build them in order to drive demand for the compute. But it's not existential that they win. Like, it's existential for them that they make money from the compute. So if people migrate from SageMaker to Modal, I mean, typically AWS still makes money.
what do you think about like fundraising? So like since like I mean like obviously you've been very successful at fundraising. How do you think about like in each stage, like what kind of benchmark do you need to hit? Like so for Series C, like I mean I know that we just like announced like the Series B last week, but like I guess like how do you think about like the Series C, and then what kind of benchmark are you trying to like hit before that?
I mean, first of all, with all these like AI rounds, like I have like no fucking idea anymore. I feel like it's like all just like throw everything out the window, and like people are just like YOLO, FOMO maybe. Like I feel like historically the way these things work is like the seed round is all about the team. There's like nothing there. Like you invest based on the team and the idea. The A round is all about the technology. You look at the technology and like, oh, they built something cool. This is a cool prototype. Like it seems to work, but it's not about the revenue. The B round is about revenue. Like you're like, okay, like better see some like revenue growth here. Like, where are the numbers? And then the C round is about like unit economics. Like, is there sustainable growth? Like, do they have good margins? Do they have good pricing power? And then, the DEF, whatever, like it's all about just like, okay, is this going to, make money at scale as a public company? Basically start to like, use more like traditional valuation methods. That is my like super reductive, like crude simplification of like fundraising process. And I don't know. I mean, I still try to, I still think there's a lot of validity to thinking those terms. I think with AI, like probably today you can go into a C round and have horrible economics, but terrible gross margins, horrible burn. But if you're showing that you have amazing researchers or crazy revenue growth, people will be like, okay, cool. That wasn't necessarily the case, a few years ago. But like also like, I mean, in its defense, I would say a lot of these companies, like the revenue growth is insane. Like the fact that like, they're growing at these, they used to have like the triple, double, that was the thing, like, for a long time. Now it's like, wait, you're just tripling? Like, what? You're like 10xing, like, and I feel like, if you're 10xing, I don't know, who cares about gross margins or like cash flow? I still care about it because like I consider myself like I think it's important to have some sort of durability, and who knows how long this like AI bubble is gonna last. But I'm just saying, I feel like a lot of investors, they're like, yeah, whatever, right? Like AI, numbers go up.
What was it like raising this round for you, and how do you
Very
think about like
straightforward. Very straightforward. I mean, we only talked basically with existing investors, and they're all interested in like putting in more money, and we wanted to keep it pretty quick, and pretty simple. So we wanted to work with someone we know. We didn't want to like extend the board necessarily or bring in new people. So I think it worked out really well. I think future rounds, like we might do a different process. We might have a more of a competitive, more of a talk to different, shop around or take a lot of different term sheets or whatever. But this B round we did was like very straightforward. We only talked to like 3 people.
how do you think about, I guess, like growing the revenue since you are at the B round right now. So you mentioned like you guys just hired like marketing people and stuff like that, and then you were hiring a GC. Like how are you thinking about growing the revenue? Is there any major strategy change or like just overall approach on getting?
I mean, we got to be out there, right? Like we got to talk, like what I'm doing right now, right? Like we got to talk about the company all the time. Like we're doing some bus ads in SF right now,
Mhm.
and like I think the goal here is like for me, I want everyone to feel like everyone else is using Modal. Like I want it to feel like, you know, this is where the cool kids are, cool but approachable. Like
Cool but approachable.
yeah. So
Um,
I think creating that awareness, like making sure people understand what Modal is, and then also making sure people understand that it's for them, and like that next time they're building something with AI, they should take a look at Modal. And then of course, like once they take a look at Modal, now we need to convert them. That's a slightly different problem. But yeah, like you have to start with awareness and positioning also.
what are, I guess, like what have you seen like when it comes to like attracting engineers, like what are something that like you feel like you guys are doing differently versus like competitors or like other people, or like by competitors I don't mean like other people in your immediate industry, but like I guess like when you were competing the best like talents, you were competing with OpenAI and stuff.
Yeah.
So how do you think about like attracting the best like engineers?
Well, we're in New York to start with,
Mhm,
so that's a little bit different in the backwaters. Yeah, and I think it's actually for us quite beneficial because we are the coolest AI infrastructure startup in New York, right? There aren't that many to begin with, but like definitely like the only one in New York doing anything like that has like tons of traction.
mhm,
We're not the only AI startup. There's a bunch of AI startups here. We're not the only infrastructure startups, but we're probably the best, fastest growing early stage infrastructure startup in New York. And I think that helps a lot. Like it's big, the talent pool is very deep. So
mhm.
I think that's like a starting point. Is like by being in New York, it has its pros and cons, but at least like this is like one of the benefits is like we are very cool in New York compared to the average startup.
Um, I guess like you mentioned New York have a deep talent pool. Like, you know, I mean, I feel like in SF, like by talent pool, I mean like there's obviously the, Stanford, Berkeley, plus like all the top tech like are here, like, Google, Meta and stuff like that. In New York, I feel like the most people I talk to, they are building, in healthcare or in something else. Like primarily people are attracting companies have like graduated from like IPO, like so basically they just like the IPO'd company core employee and then started a new company. That's kind of like the main thing in New York. Like so what do you think about the AI talent? Like where are they coming from?
Yeah, I mean I think I first of all, like I don't know if we necessarily hire like a ton of people with like AI experience, but like if you look at AI experience, like at least in New York, like there's been a lot of retail and a lot of e-commerce and stuff like that, and they all needed people doing like recommendation systems and stuff like that. So there's like a fair amount of that. I would say the biggest stuff is like probably finance. Like there's a lot of people in finance like building very complex systems,
Mhm,
trading systems and using. I mean, they would never call it AI in finance, but like machine learning and
mhm,
statistics, right? Like there are people who are incredibly smart and very good at math
mhm,
and programming, and so finance has been a great place to hire too. And then of course a lot of the big companies like Google, Facebook, they all have offices here. Anthropic, like they all have like a lot of people here too. And
mhm,
there are some local companies, Datadog, Mongo, Cockroach, like pretty good talent as well.
mm. Um, I guess like another question I had was like I guess like from the building a company perspective, since you mentioned that like you are spending a lot of time on you know big up the revenue slash marketing or like slash like spreading the knowledge, what are some, I guess like what are some advice for founders who are building in the infrastructure space but they just started, like what are something that you feel like you've done that you wish you could have done differently versus like what are something that you feel like you've done right?
Uh, I think something we did right that I would advise everyone to start with to think about although it's easy to say because we started it during the ZERP era. But I think it's very important to pick a problem that's like kind of hard, but not too hard. And like I always, tell people, pick a problem that you think is like realistically solvable in about 1.5 to 2 years, because that's about the right time frame. Because like if it's easy to solve in like a few weeks, like you're not going to have pricing power and durability. You need to focus on, at least in infrastructure. Like if you want to be an infrastructure company, you have to love infrastructure, and you want to have, you have to, be ready to build a lot of it yourself, because that's the whole point of it. So pick a problem you can build like a convincing prototype in a couple of years. Like it has to be that complex, because otherwise, like, what's the point? What's your moat? I think. So I think we did that quite well. It took a year or two actually to get it to like a reasonable point where it's like kind of useful. I would say, what else? I mean, I think you should talk to a lot of potential users, but you should actually ignore most of what they say. You should listen to their problems they're explaining to you, but I think you should like ignore like any type of solution that like, if people are asking for like a particular feature, that's like almost certainly not what you should build. You should try to understand, well, why do you need this feature? And then why? And then like that, in that question, like you'll discover like a real pain point they're explaining. I mean, what else? Like I would say like a mistake. You asked about mistakes. Probably like the only consistent mistakes I've made like a couple of times now that I've been like annoyed with, that I'm trying to change, is I think we've been like we've been like not aggressive enough about hiring the right people. And often we sort of looked at the bottlenecks and we said, oh, you know what? Like, sales is not the bottleneck right now because we don't have enough deals in the pipe anyway. So we need to first fix that. But then as it turns out, like 6 months later, now you have a lot of deals in the pipeline, and like now you're like way behind on sales hiring. And one thing I sort of, regret in the past is like, I should have just like hired like all the roles at the same time and like kind of extrapolated a little bit. Like, what are the things, if everything works out well, then what are the things I'm going to need in 6 months? And then like hire for all of those roles at the same time. Not trying to like sequence it, and not trying to like analyze it from like a bottleneck perspective and start with the first bottleneck. I'm a systems thinker, so I often try to like analyze bottleneck by bottleneck and focus on that. But I kind of realized like in such a complex system, if you know that like unblocking this bottleneck is going to lead you to this to be a bottleneck, just hire for both of them at the same time. Just paralyze.
Sorry, keep going. Yeah.
No, that's what I was going to say. I mean, like at least like so far things have generally worked out. So I think we've our sin has been the error of, what's it called? We erred on the side of we should have committed to more things.
How, I guess, like from I'm sure like the investors that are listening are probably going to ask like, what is like a opportunity in the infrastructure space? Like, what are some stuff that you would personally put your money on besides Modal?
I mean, I do a bunch of angel investing. I'm quite bullish on infrastructure as a whole. I just think it takes guts, for founders to solve things on a very foundational level. I mean, one company that I'm a very proud angel is in Turbo Puffer, and they were like vector database number 25 roughly. But I think they've been able to carve out a fantastic niche, just being like super, dogmatic about how to build a system in a very efficient way, and just like winning on like performance and price. I'm pretty bullish on like actually like file systems and databases and storage and stuff like that. I think it's been kind of a disappointing category overall. Like databases has been notoriously hard to make money from. But like the winners, like, if you look at like Mongo, or you go back and look at Oracle or whatever, like there are some like undeniably large winners. And so I think, finding the right database primitives, I think there's a lot of gap in the market for like better databases. It's been a long time since we saw any major innovation. So I'm excited to see there are a couple of new like database startups coming up, and I think it's exciting. What else on the infrastructure side? I mean, I'm personally quite interested in like new model architectures, new ways to train models. I think a lot of what we're doing around transformers and how we train models. It's actually quite inefficient. How we
Mhm.
store state in agents. Like, I don't know how to make money from any of these things. But like I think they represent a lot of like promise and direction for like I would be interested if money was an objective and I started over, like I would probably pursue one of those, deeper sort of problems in deep learning, and research it on my own. I think there's a lot of exciting stuff there.
That's super cool. Okay, so I want to wrap with a 1 minute fire round. What's your favorite book?
Favorite book? Jeez, I don't know. I read so many books. What's like a book I've read many times? I don't know. When I was little, I read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy 3 times. That was my favorite book when I was like 12.
Oh my
I don't
god.
think I've read it since then.
Um,
Like a good business book is actually, it's like simple read. It's Andrew Grove's High Output Management, and not because it's like super profound, but just because I find it like it covers all the basics and it does it quite well. And it's pretty concise.
um, it is pretty concise. Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Dinner party, like I can invite anyone.
It's your party.
It's my party. I mean, they're probably not going to show up, but I mean, I'd love to hang out with, I don't know, Jensen or someone.
Who made the biggest impact in your career?
I mean, indirectly, probably Daniel Ek, because he started Spotify. I think the CTO at Spotify was also someone who I learned a lot from. Oscar Stahl. I learned a lot from him about management. I was like pretty unmanageable early in my career, but for some reason, I think he took a liking to me, and I think he proved to me that he was able to turn me into I don't know. I think I was kind of rough. Like, I was hard to work with when I was young.
Yeah, how do you like manage your own employee? I feel like the smarter a person gets, like the harder to manage they are, basically.
Yeah, which is like why you shouldn't manage them. Like, you should just like let them do whatever they want to.
Oh my
And then you have to give them a lot of feedback. You have to like ask them tough questions. You can always nerd side people. They're like, I don't think you can do this. Like, is that possible? And then they do it just to prove you wrong. So like my feeling is like with smart people, as long as you set the context, it's like this sort of Netflix, like, some of the cliche about at this point, but like context over control. Like, just
Mhm.
like explain to them, like, here are the bigger picture things that we need to fix as a company. And like, if you hire like high agency motivated people and they're smart, they can go and fix it.
Where can we find you outside of work?
Outside of work, I mean, I do 2 things in my life today. I work, and then I go out and hang out with my kids and my wife. That's
Okay,
it.
love that. Amazing. Well, Erik, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was such a fun conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great coming. It was awesome.
Okay, let me quickly end stream. One sec.